This year, consumer DNA databases now number in the tens of millions, recently surpassing the 50 million mark, making matches and revelations more likely than ever. That scale means more connections uncovered, more long-held secrets exposed, and more families facing truths they never expected. For some, results finally brought long-overdue closure. For others, DNA pulled back a curtain to hidden histories that disrupted entire households. These stories range from shock over newfound siblings to questions of medical ethics, adoption reunions, and even privacy battles. And at the heart of it all lies one of the most common yet devastating surprises: discovering that your parentage isn't what you thought. 1 in 4 people face shocking parentage surprises. What makes this reality even more striking is that research shows it does happen, though less often than headlines might suggest. Multiple studies estimate that about 2–4% of people who take consumer DNA tests encounter what's called an NPE, or not parent-expected discovery. In other words, a small but significant percentage of test takers find out that one of their assumed biological parents isn't actually related to them genetically. While the number is lower than the old 1 in 4 claim, it still translates into millions of real cases worldwide. At first, these figures can seem like dry statistics, but each percentage point is attached to a story: people discovering a hidden biological father, learning that a parent concealed an adoption, or realizing that a family history they memorized since childhood doesn't align with the science. The suddenness of these revelations makes them especially disruptive. A BMC psychiatry study on NPE experiences reported common reactions such as shock, confusion, a fractured sense of identity, and strained family dynamics. Some individuals describe it as having the ground pulled out from beneath them. For years, most people who spat into those little tubes expected lighthearted results: an ancestry breakdown, a map of migration, or maybe the digital appearance of a distant cousin. The expansion of DNA databases has changed that picture. As these collections have now grown into the tens of millions, the likelihood of uncovering a close genetic match has gone up sharply. That database growth doesn't create secrets, but it does mean that previously hidden relationships are more likely to be revealed, and once exposed, they cannot easily be ignored. The emotional aftermath varies from family to family. In some households, results confirm long-whispered stories and bring resolution. Parents may finally admit to choices made decades earlier, and children may find comfort in answers that were denied to them for most of their lives. In those cases, the truth can foster closeness and healing, but in other families, the opposite occurs. Secrets kept for years may feel like betrayals once they are laid bare, creating rifts that can end relationships between siblings, parents, or spouses. The revelations also reach beyond immediate relatives. Extended family members can suddenly find themselves caught in the ripple effect, facing awkward explanations, challenges to established roles, and a reconsideration of the shared family story. For some, it leads to redefined bonds and new family circles. For others, it opens wounds that take years to mend if they ever do. What the research makes clear is that these are not isolated cases of scandal or intrigue. They are increasingly common outcomes whenever DNA promises to deliver the truth. And while some of these stories remain confined to private households, others unfold in far more dramatic ways. Sometimes, DNA doesn't just introduce difficult truths. It brings back figures that were thought to be gone forever, reopening chapters of family history no one expected to revisit. The father who died but was alive for 30 years. Here's a typical case, drawn from the kinds of stories cataloged in recent studies. A person who grew up believing their father had died discovered through DNA that he had been alive all along. As in many accounts shared in surveys and research, what began with a simple test meant to trace ancestry or connect with distant relatives instead revealed one of the most consequential truths a family can keep hidden. In this case, the individual submitted their sample expecting ordinary results: new cousins, a clearer picture of heritage, maybe a surprise surname or two. What returned was entirely different. Among the matches appeared a man identified not as a distant connection but as a direct parent. It was not an error or a fluke. After cross-checking with relatives, the evidence was indisputable. The father she thought had died decades earlier was alive. The shock of the reveal quickly gave way to something deeper: a collapse of trust. Family members had maintained the story for years, offering only vague explanations, a handful of hidden photographs, and silence whenever questions arose. The DNA result forced them to admit the truth. He had not died but had left the family. They believed it would be kinder to erase him from her life entirely than to maintain a complicated presence. For her, finding this out was less about reunion than it was about realizing that a foundational part of her identity had been built on concealment. Stripped down to its core, the revelation created a split in her perception of family. She had lived most of her life reconciling with grief and loss, only to learn that what required healing was deception, not absence. BMC Psychiatry has documented that people experiencing these NPE discoveries often report grief, feelings of betrayal, and struggles with personal identity alongside the difficult possibility of reconnecting. This case mirrored those findings with unsettling clarity. Still, the story did not end with anger alone. The knowledge that her father was alive offered a chance, however fraught, to meet him. That meeting was layered with emotions, confusion, hesitation, curiosity, and pain. Each exchange raised as many questions as it answered. Neither reunion nor rejection could erase the 30 years of separation, but the possibility of connection, however fragile, could no longer be denied. What stands out from this example is how effortlessly a single test dismantled decades of carefully constructed silence. It showed that while secrecy can remain intact across generations, the expansion of genetic databases makes it fragile in the face of even routine testing. For this individual, the test reshaped her understanding of family overnight. And just as DNA reshaped a private family history here, it has also reshaped public ones, sometimes through the most unexpected platforms. In another case, what started as a casual social media challenge turned into an extraordinary story of two people learning they were far closer than they could have ever imagined. Twins reunited through viral TikTok DNA challenge. In early 2025, stories of surprising DNA discoveries were drawing growing public attention. Some reunions played out quietly in private, while others unfolded in front of large audiences online. Researchers have noted that social media often amplifies these moments, turning what might once have been an intimate family exchange into something shared and witnessed by thousands. But one well-documented case, reported by The New Yorker, shows how profoundly a DNA test alone can rewrite a life story, without needing a viral gimmick to bring it into focus. Mia Griffin, who was adopted as an infant, had lived her entire life with questions about her biological family. When she decided to send her DNA to one of the major consumer testing companies, she expected little more than generalized ancestry results and perhaps a distant cousin match. Instead, the database instantly connected her to close biological relatives, including people she never knew existed. Unlike the vague family stories she had grown up with, this was concrete proof, scientific confirmation of ties that had been hidden from her all along. The emotional weight of those results was immediate. When her match notifications lit up, they didn't just signal relatives in some abstract chart. They pointed directly to siblings and parents she had never met. Within weeks of submitting her test, Mia found herself exchanging messages with genetic family members and piecing together both her origin story and the circumstances that led to her adoption. For her, the discovery cut through years of uncertainty, offering both answers and a path toward reconnection. When Mia finally arranged to meet her biological relatives, the moment was as raw as it was revealing. Reports describe hugs that carried the force of decades, conversations layered with relief, awkwardness, and excitement, and the quiet realization that absence had not erased resemblance. Just as in other research-documented cases, she experienced a collision of feelings: joy at finding kin, grief for the lost years, and hesitancy about what to do next with these new connections. Genetic counseling experts point to cases like Griffin's as proof of how testing has accelerated the pace of family reunions. What once might have required searches through sealed records or expensive private investigators can now occur with a few clicks, and sometimes in a matter of days. For adoptees in particular, the shift is enormous. DNA databases act not just as search tools, but as bridges, compressing timelines and placing relatives face-to-face far sooner than many are ready for. The broader trend is equally revealing. Many reunions today are documented through platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok. Family meetings that once happened behind closed doors can now appear in feeds watched by strangers. That visibility adds another layer of complexity. The emotions of discovery are heightened not just by the presence of long-lost relatives, but also by the awareness that others are watching the reunion unfold in real time. Mia's story wasn't built on a viral stunt, but its coverage underscored how public these journeys can become once they resonate with wider audiences. What stands out is how profoundly one simple test reshaped Mia's understanding of who she was and who she belonged to. Her experience offers a clear example of how DNA results can collapse distance, erase long-standing uncertainties, and bring people together with almost startling speed. And yet, if one unexpected sibling or parent can be life-changing, the shock takes on another scale entirely when a single person discovers not one or two newfound relatives, but dozens. The man with 47 half-siblings. When one man logged into his DNA account, the results went far beyond what he had imagined. Instead of the expected few new relatives, his matches revealed dozens of genetic half-siblings, all connected by the same sperm donor father. In some documented donor conception cases, a single donor has fathered several dozen children, with reports of individuals discovering groups as large as 30 or more. For him, what began as a routine search for heritage quickly turned into a collision with an enormous, unexpected sibling network. The scale was overwhelming. Growing up, he accepted the explanation his mother had given about using a donor, and he assumed that meant maybe a few unknown half-brothers or sisters scattered somewhere out there. What he hadn't pictured was opening his test results only to see lists of names stretching down the screen, each one linked to him through the same donor. Photographs exchanged through the platform confirmed the connection. Shared jawlines, repeated smiles, and expressions that seemed to echo across faces of people who had never met. Once introductions began, the reality set in even further. One sibling organized a private group chat, and it instantly became a hub of activity. Every few weeks, new half-siblings joined as more people ran their tests, expanding the network. Conversations captured both curiosity and disbelief, comparing family stories about the donor profile, cross-referencing medical information, and marveling at uncanny similarities in talents and traits. Some noted overlapping interests and recognizable quirks, while others focused on broader concerns, such as shared genetic risks that suddenly felt less theoretical. That sudden expansion of family also cast light on a deeper problem. For decades, fertility practices in many places operated with minimal oversight, and limits on donor use were vague, inconsistent, or unenforced. Clinics often reused the same donor many times without informing prospective parents how many children already existed from that choice. By the time consumer DNA tests took off, those quiet decisions meant that donor-conceived people could discover dozens of unexpected siblings at once. Cases like his fed into broader policy conversations about whether strict limits should be enforced, how families should be informed, and what safeguards are needed to protect both health and identity. For the man who stumbled into this discovery, the adjustment was not immediate. At first, it felt more like a tidal wave than an opportunity. Over time, however, the group conversations gave him a sense of shared belonging, even in a form of family he had never imagined. Rather than finding one missing piece of a personal history, he ended up in the middle of a complex living network that kept growing around him. These connections capture how modern DNA testing continues to redefine established ideas of kinship, raising questions not just in personal circles, but in ethics, medicine, and law. And while donor networks may highlight gaps in present-day policy, other discoveries reach backward across centuries, uncovering how survival and identity were navigated in some of history's darkest moments. Survival by false identities during the Holocaust. When families today use DNA testing, they sometimes uncover not just relatives or new ancestry percentages, but entire identities that were rewritten in moments of crisis. Across different parts of the world, archives show that many people during the 20th century and earlier adopted new names, changed ethnic self-descriptions, or altered records entirely in order to survive persecution, displacement, or political instability. DNA can now expose those hidden shifts, reconnecting descendants with lineages that paper documents alone could never reveal. One family's modern-day test results highlighted this reality in striking ways. Their DNA matches linked them not to the familiar surnames passed down through oral tradition, but to entirely different family networks, names, and regions that had never been acknowledged in their household. At first, it seemed like a mistake. Only when the results were viewed against surviving records did the picture take shape. Generations earlier, their relatives had redefined themselves in order to stay safe during times of violence and exclusion. In practice, this meant many of the certificates and registry entries they had long trusted were not faithful reflections of their biological history. Birthplaces were shifted, surnames altered, religious or ethnic fields left blank or falsified. Under the stress of persecution, families made choices that disrupted the official record but ensured that descendants could live on. DNA analysis connected those fragments, showing that what had appeared to be unrelated clusters were in fact branches from the same family tree. The emotional impact of confronting this truth was considerable. For decades, the family had embraced a cultural trajectory they thought was continuous and unbroken. The evidence now suggested otherwise. Their ancestors had actively concealed or reshaped that identity to survive. Instead of clarifying a single true heritage, the DNA expanded their story, forcing them to accept both the erased lineage and the survival identities that had been carried for so long in silence. Such moments echo findings described in contemporary studies, where discovering altered origins often leaves descendants balancing grief, pride, and a more complicated understanding of their past. Re-examining family artifacts with this new knowledge revealed details that had once seemed like insignificant clerical errors. Migration documents included suspicious inconsistencies. Marriage licenses contained multiple spellings of supposedly stable surnames. Even religious records suggested conversions that were never acknowledged later. Viewed together, those irregularities reinforced what the DNA had made clear. The family's very survival had required new labels, official or otherwise, that masked a hidden continuity of bloodlines beneath. Rather than reject the generations that had made those choices, the descendants chose to honor them. They began to approach their genealogy as layered rather than linear, recognizing both the names taken for protection and the ones rooted in blood ties. In doing so, they gave meaning to altered identities not as betrayals of truth, but as acts of courage under impossible conditions. Cases like this illustrate how DNA testing is changing not only how people think about family, but also how they reckon with history. For some, it means reconciling with erased identities and survival strategies from the past. For others, the most dramatic surprises come not from ancestors in archives, but from unexpected connections discovered in their own immediate lives, including revelations that unfold inside familiar workplaces. CDO finds parents were her own employees. Sometimes DNA testing doesn't just uncover biological parents, it reveals they have been much closer all along. Research and survey accounts describe people discovering that the individuals who raised them weren't their biological family, only to learn through DNA that their birth parents turned out to be far more familiar figures, neighbors, old family friends, or even coworkers they had known for years. These situations collapse the boundary between private identity and public life in ways few could anticipate. In documented cases, adoptees or donor-conceived individuals submitted their saliva samples expecting nothing more than an ancestry breakdown, but the match results pointed directly to people they already saw every day. Instead of a new name or a stranger appearing in the database, it was someone whose phone number was already in their contacts, whose face they passed in the hallway, or whose door was just across the street. The tests didn't only rewrite their biological history, they reframed their present environment completely. Accounts of these scenarios often describe a strange blend of recognition and disbelief. On one hand, the person was no longer a stranger. They'd already shared moments of conversation, laughter, or work collaboration. On the other, the DNA introduced an entirely new context to that relationship. This was not simply a coworker, neighbor, or family friend, but a biological parent. The ordinary spaces of office floors, childhood blocks, or living room visits suddenly became the unlikely stage, where hidden lineage had been unfolding unnoticed for years. For those caught in these discoveries, the emotional response can be complicated. Some describe it as a relief, because the distance of searching for unknown relatives collapses into the comfort of familiarity. Others feel shock or even betrayal, wrestling with the knowledge that someone close to them carried a secret capable of altering their entire self-understanding. In either case, the disruption is profound. The divide between personal and professional, between private memory and everyday routine, disappears in an instant. The practical challenges also ripple outward. How do you renegotiate a neighborly chat when you now know that person is your biological parent? How do you balance an office hierarchy with a familial bond revealed by science? These are not abstract questions, but ones that people navigating NPE discoveries, not parent expected, have faced directly. Researchers studying NPE outcomes have emphasized the strain that secrecy places on relationships, noting that the sudden exposure of hidden truths often forces individuals to redefine roles, boundaries, and expectations in ways that feel disorienting. In many families, silence about origins was once seen as the kindest option or the safest safeguard. But consumer DNA testing has steadily dismantled that silence, bringing hidden relationships to light in settings no one anticipated. Where family ties exist, they will eventually show themselves once samples find their way into the swelling databases. And as more people test, the chances of such revelations only intensify. What these stories illustrate is the sheer unpredictability of DNA testing outcomes. Sometimes the truth emerges in a workplace cafeteria or just across the street from home. Other times, the consequences stretch into entire medical systems, uncovering patterns of secrecy on a scale that affects not just a handful of families, but hundreds. And that broader impact became undeniable when disturbing details about reproductive medicine began surfacing, details that only DNA testing could have exposed. The fertility doctor scandal, father of 200+. One of the most unsettling discoveries to emerge from consumer DNA testing has been the fertility doctor scandals. Over the past decade, multiple cases have shown that certain physicians secretly used their own sperm or substituted donors without consent, while treating patients who had turned to them for reproductive help. In these documented cases, DNA later revealed dozens, And in some investigations, far more children all traced back to the very doctors who had claimed to be facilitating safe, transparent treatments. The truth usually surfaced in fragments. Adult children, often testing their DNA for fun or curiosity, began noticing dozens of close genetic matches with no obvious family connection. Each new test added another piece to the puzzle. What at first looked like coincidences became impossible to dismiss once the matches stretched across entire states and regions. In some of the largest scandals uncovered, more than 50 children were eventually connected to the same physician, and the numbers continued climbing as new results came in. For the families involved, the fallout was devastating. Parents believed they had made deliberate and informed choices about their fertility treatments, carefully selecting donor characteristics, health backgrounds, and family histories. To learn that those safeguards had been ignored, that their doctor had replaced agreed-upon donors with himself, was a deep betrayal. Instead of medical integrity, there had been manipulation. For the children conceived under these circumstances, the revelations carried even heavier weight. The man responsible was not a faceless donor, but the physician who had occupied a position of trust and authority. The harm extended far beyond emotional betrayal. Many donor-conceived individuals emphasize the importance of accurate medical information, since unknown hereditary conditions can affect not just themselves but their own children. In cases where a doctor acted without disclosure, those children grew up with medical histories based on fabricated or incomplete information. The absence of truth carried risks to both physical health and personal identity. These scandals also underscored the weaknesses in oversight. Fertility clinics in many countries operated for years under inconsistent regulations, leaving space for abuses of trust at the most intimate levels. Only after commercial genetic testing became widespread did these truths begin to surface, exposing misconduct that might otherwise have remained hidden indefinitely. The revelations led to lawsuits, criminal investigations, and growing public pressure for reform. Across legislatures, policymakers were pushed to debate stricter rules on record keeping, disclosure practices, and limits on donor use to prevent similar violations. Courts, however, struggled to define the boundaries of accountability. Was this fraud, malpractice, or a type of sexual violation under the law? Families pressed for answers, but the legal system often lagged behind the scale and specificity of the harm. Meanwhile, advocacy groups called for international registries and stronger consent protections, insisting that children born through donor conception deserve transparent records from the very start. What makes these cases especially striking is how their discovery began with something ordinary: a simple home DNA kit purchased and mailed in without much thought. Instead of ancestry charts or quirky cousin matches, families received evidence of deception sustained over decades. The scale, the secrecy, and the betrayal turned recreational science into a tool of accountability, reshaping both personal lives and national conversations about reproductive ethics. Not every shocking discovery comes from misconduct on that scale. Some situations are more intimate but still deeply unsettling, forcing people to reconsider the hidden connections inside their own families and marriages. When marriage turns out to be kinship, DNA testing has also revealed situations where marriages themselves contained hidden kinship. Social media accounts and survey reports describe couples learning not only that they were life partners, but that they were genetically related as well. In some cases, the results place spouses as distant cousins. In more troubling discoveries, individuals have found they were unexpectedly close biological relatives, such as half-siblings, creating enormous personal and emotional fallout. One woman from a documented case had taken a test expecting ethnicity updates and lighthearted curiosity, only to see her husband appear in her match list not just as a spouse but as a genetic connection. The system flagged him as a third cousin. Neither of them had any prior knowledge of shared ancestry, and their families had never shown evidence of overlap. The result was a shock, reframing something as intimate as their marriage certificate with the cold clarity of a genealogical chart. Initially, accepting this news was disorienting. Couples in these situations often describe a mix of disbelief and unease, questioning how to place their ordinary life together within a family diagram that now contained tangled branches. When the distance was defined as third cousins, as in this case, specialists reassured them it was far enough removed to avoid medical or ethical concerns that arise with closer relatives. Past generations often lived in small, insular communities where distant cousin marriages were not uncommon. These explanations helped the couple contextualize their discovery, though the emotional weight still lingered. For others who have experienced closer genetic matches, however, the impact has been far more destabilizing. Reports gathered in online forums and surveys indicate that some marriages broke apart after siblings unknowingly wed or discovered closer than expected ties. The BMC Psychiatry study of not parent-expected individuals notes that such discoveries produce high levels of shock, confusion, and even trauma. as people suddenly confront stigma, legal uncertainty, and emotional fracture in their most private relationships. In the most severe cases, family bonds unravel entirely. Even when the relationships persist, the knowledge forces a redefinition of identity. Couples who once discussed ancestry as a hobby now approach it as part of their immediate household reality. Relatives from both sides may find themselves drawn into expanded family conversations they never considered before. Everyday interactions, dinners, reunions, holiday visits, carry new layers of meaning because they now exist within an unexpectedly shared family network. As the size of DNA databases grows, more of these overlaps are becoming visible. Millions of uploaded profiles increase the odds that distant cousins are living not just nearby but under the same roof. What centuries of missing records might have erased is now restored through genetic evidence. These discoveries leave couples with difficult questions. What does kinship change about love, and how does society view private choices when science highlights unanticipated connections? The law also complicates this picture. Some jurisdictions treat marriages between certain categories of relatives as invalid, even if the relationship was unknown at the time. In situations where DNA unexpectedly revealed close biological ties, couples have faced uncertainty about whether their legal marriage remains valid. It raises an unresolved issue. How should laws written for deliberate relationships adapt to accidental discoveries? And while these cases unfold in private homes, other families have experienced similar shocks with roots in history and service. In those stories, DNA doesn't just redraw a household tree, it reframes entire national narratives tied to sacrifice and legacy. Military secrets, POW father with second family abroad. DNA testing has also uncovered long-hidden ties created during wars and long military assignments. Families who thought they understood their heritage have sometimes learned that deployments led to second households abroad, or that connections formed in distant places remained unacknowledged for decades. Journalistic investigations and accounts collected through DNA databases show that the separations of military service occasionally left behind children, who only now, through genetic testing, are being recognized by relatives thousands of miles away. In many of these cases, the story began innocently. A son or daughter submitted a test expecting to find background on ancestral migration or a set of distant cousins. But as the results settled in, new siblings appeared, some in faraway countries, many with no awareness of one another. Over time, the cluster of close genetic relatives revealed what no paper record had suggested. Their father or grandfather had started another family while serving overseas, creating parallel lineages unknown on either side. What followed was rarely straightforward. Matches often came with skepticism at first. Could this be an error or perhaps an unusually close cousin line? But as additional family members across both continents tested and confirmed the same parent, the truth became undeniable. The man long remembered in one household for his service, his discipline, or his sacrifices abroad was also known in another as a father figure who had raised children, shared daily life, and left behind a local legacy. The overlap of these identities forced relatives to piece together a more complex picture than the patriotic or personal stories they had grown up with. The emotional reactions varied but shared a common intensity. For some, the discovery felt like betrayal, an untold chapter rewritten by science decades later. For others, it was a source of connection, opening doorways to siblings they never imagined. Families reported recognizing mannerisms, shared physical features, even talents passed down from a man who had occupied two places at once. Silence, distance, and history had concealed it, but DNA laid the hidden truth open. Researchers note that historical archives from earlier military eras almost never contain such details. Service records document deployments, injuries, and medals, but rarely interpersonal bonds formed abroad. Without modern technology, connections across continents would have gone undetected, fading quietly into generational memory. The rise of consumer DNA testing changed that, restoring entire networks of kinship that paper trails had overlooked or erased. These revelations underline how family stories tied to service are not always simple. They show that military sacrifice and personal life often intersected in ways invisible to official history, but deeply real to those now discovering the results. For modern descendants, it means carrying a narrative both broader and more conflicted than they had imagined. And while these surprises may reach across battle lines and borders, other discoveries strike closer to home, disrupting not just hidden lineages overseas, but the very foundations of families who thought they knew their beginnings from the moment of birth. Hospital switch, 1980s babies in the wrong families. In the late 1980s, a mistake in a hospital ward went unnoticed for decades, until modern DNA testing finally exposed it. Families who believed they knew their children's origins learned, through undeniable genetic evidence, that two babies had been placed in the wrong households. The The truth first surfaced when an adult child submitted a cheek swab, expecting routine ancestry results. What came back instead was a series of mismatched parent-child connections that no one could ignore. Further testing confirmed the impossible. The individuals who had grown up with one name in one home and under one family's story were not biologically tied to the parents who raised them. Instead, their DNA linked them directly to another family whose child had also been delivered on that same hospital ward decades earlier. Each test tightened the circle until the conclusion was unavoidable. The newborns had been switched at birth. At first, both families rejected the finding as too extreme to be serious. They rechecked records, questioned the labs, and wondered if the algorithms had introduced some sort of error. But as relatives from both sides tested their samples, every new result pointed in the same direction. Eventually, hospital logs from that time shed light on what likely occurred: a mislabeled infant, a rushed change in the maternity unit, and a moment of confusion that had never been corrected. The effects of this discovery reached straight into the core of family life. Parents, already decades into their roles, were crushed by guilt and anger, feeling as if they had both gained and lost a child in the same instant. Every memory, first birthdays, graduations, holidays, took on a painful weight when framed against the mistake that had shaped them. For the now-grown children, identity itself became a fractured concept. They loved the families who had cared for them, but DNA created a second set of parents and siblings that demanded recognition. Adapting to this reality proved slow and complicated. Adults on both sides had lived most of their lives without this knowledge, which left little room for an easy reset. New siblings had to decide what role they wanted in each other's lives. Parents worked to balance honoring the bonds they had built with acknowledging the bonds that had been lost. What had seemed like a straightforward family lineage splintered into two overlapping branches, with emotions swinging between gratitude for love received and grief for what had been missed. Documented cases like these are rare but real. Newsweek, survey reports, and medical studies have all confirmed that switched-at-birth incidents do occur, even if infrequently. The BMC psychiatry research further shows that those who confront unexpected parentage discoveries often report heavy psychosocial strain, ranging from fractured identity to disrupted relationships. Without widespread DNA testing, these families would never have known. With it, a silence of nearly 40 years was broken in an instant. If a single test can rewrite the structure of ordinary family life so completely, the same technology has also unearthed far darker stories. Sometimes a holiday gift doesn't reveal hidden relatives or long-lost siblings. It exposes a link to crimes buried deep in the past. When family past points to murder, it began quietly, the way so many stories in this space do, with a simple decision to explore family history. A young woman received a DNA kit as a gift and mailed off her sample, expecting little more than ancestry percentages and a few distant cousin matches. When the results finally came in, the report looked ordinary at first. But slipped among the standard data was something that stood out: a note indicating that law enforcement had requested access in connection with an unsolved case. What had begun as curiosity now carried the weight of a criminal investigation. Weeks later, investigators reached out. They explained that DNA fragments collected from a decades-old crime scene had been re-examined using today's massive databases. Her profile overlapped with that crime scene sample, not enough to implicate her directly, but enough to identify a close biological connection. The implication was staggering. Someone in her family had left their genetic trace at the site of a violent murder that had remained unsolved for years. The news shattered long-held assumptions within her family. To themselves and their community, they had always been unremarkable, the portrait of ordinary life. Now suspicion crept into daily conversations. Old photographs were revisited, relatives second-guessed each other, and once stable family roles felt uncertain. Even those who had lived far away from the crime's time and place felt marked by association. For investigators, this kind of progress was unprecedented just a generation ago. Police had long been able to preserve biological samples, but without a suspect or direct comparison, those samples sat dormant in storage. The spread of consumer DNA testing changed that reality. With tens of millions of profiles uploaded freely, even partial overlaps could direct detectives toward entire family networks, giving them leads where none had existed for decades. Legal and privacy experts, however, have raised sharp concerns over this growth in forensic genealogy. Some regulators point out that customers who submit DNA to learn about their roots might unknowingly expose their relatives to police investigations. State and federal policies have begun responding, with certain jurisdictions restricting how law enforcement can access these databases. The debate remains unsettled. How far should justice reach when its tools come from personal data that millions assumed was private? The divide was not abstract for this family. They faced the brutal reality that one of their relatives might be tied to a murder investigation while also grappling with questions of fairness. Was their participation in a recreational test ever meant to place them inside a police file? Yet for the victims and their loved ones, the equation was different. Finally, a chance at closure in cases that had gone cold for decades. That tension, justice for victims versus privacy for families, is what gives this debate its ongoing urgency. What this case demonstrated most of all was the dual power of modern DNA testing. It can illuminate hidden branches of family trees, but it can also resurrect actions from the past that some would have preferred stayed forgotten. And just as testing has linked people to crimes, it has also produced revelations that stretch in an entirely different direction, uncovering ancient traces preserved within the human genome itself. The man who was 15% Neanderthal. Among the wide variety of DNA testing results that emerged in recent years, some of the most captivating involved not new siblings or hidden parents, but traces of ancestry reaching back to ancient human relatives. One man's results drew attention because his test flagged an unusually high percentage of Neanderthal markers, far above what consumer companies typically report. For most modern humans of non-African ancestry, Neanderthal DNA accounts for roughly 1 to 2% of their genetic code. A result showing much more than that is so unusual that geneticists caution it should be re-verified in a professional laboratory before being treated as accurate. Still, even the standard 1 to 2% carries a fascinating reminder. Almost everyone has some genetic connection to this extinct human species. Neanderthals lived in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years and interbred with early modern humans when their paths crossed. The small amounts of Neanderthal DNA that remain in people today are like genetic echoes of those encounters tens of thousands of years ago. Usually these fragments are scattered as tiny segments across the genome, but they continue to influence traits in the modern population. Researchers have linked certain immune system responses, skin and hair characteristics, and even patterns of fat storage to DNA inherited long ago from Neanderthals. When companies like 23andMe and Nebula Genomics include Neanderthal ancestry in test results, they do so by highlighting specific markers known to come from those ancient lines. For most customers, it's a curiosity, something to mention in conversation, because the reported percentage rarely exceeds that narrow 1 to 2% range. However, any outlier readings immediately draw interest. They raise questions about whether a rare concentration of Neanderthal DNA has managed to survive relatively intact in a modern lineage, or whether quirks in methodology or data quality may be distorting the results. Geneticists emphasize the importance of context. Finding more markers than usual doesn't mean someone is closer to being Neanderthal, but rather that a few of their inherited segments stand out in ways worth further analysis. For the man whose test initially suggested far more than average, the outcome triggered both skepticism and focus from researchers. His profile was checked multiple times to make sure a technical error wasn't responsible. Any such extraordinary number must be approached with caution, yet the case still provided scientists with an opportunity to communicate important points about genetic inheritance. Most people can expect a small percentage and nothing beyond, but unusual readings, whether valid or not, highlight how layered and unpredictable the story of our DNA really is. On a personal level, consumers who see these Neanderthal traces often react with a mix of humor and curiosity. Some wonder if their sturdy builds or endurance on long hikes can be traced back to that ancient ancestry. Others take comfort in the idea that they carry a genetic connection to a lineage that shaped the human story, even if it no longer exists in physical form. These fragments make visible what history alone could not. Everyday people embodying the survival of interactions that occurred tens of thousands of years ago. Cases like this remind us that DNA testing isn't only about finding relatives who live nearby. It can also bring into focus vast, unexpected timelines written into the human body. But while ancient ancestry raises intriguing questions about prehistoric identity, other results cut far closer to home, reshaping the cultural and personal identities people thought defined them from birth. Italian no more, 100% Irish truth. For one content creator, the surprise came not from discovering new relatives, but from realizing that everything she thought she knew about her cultural identity was built on the wrong foundation. She had always described herself as proudly Italian. Recipes, holiday traditions, house decorations, and even the stories she told her children were drawn from a heritage she believed firmly tied to Italy. When she agreed to test her DNA on camera using a MyHeritage kit, she treated it as entertainment, an opportunity to prove what she thought was already obvious. But when the results loaded on screen, the chart didn't show Italian ancestry at all. Instead, it displayed close to 90% Irish. Rather than scattered origins across several regions, her genetic profile concentrated almost entirely in one place. That collapse of assumption into evidence was startling, especially given how central Italian identity had been to her everyday life. A single readout had redefined who she was, or at least who she thought she had been. At first, she reacted with disbelief, wondering how DNA could so quickly erase years of family stories. Like many people who take these tests, she soon learned that ethnicity estimates are based on reference populations and statistical comparisons, and different companies may use slightly different panels. Still, when a person's ancestry is highly concentrated, as hers was, the percentages can come back looking surprisingly one-sided. What she had spent decades framing as Italian tradition was not a reflection of DNA, but the result of cultural choices carried forward in her household. Her next step was to press her family for answers. At reunions and gatherings, she began raising questions about why the DNA results showed no trace of Italy. Slowly, fragments of history surfaced. Generations back, her relatives had migrated from Ireland. But in their new community, Irish roots carried prejudice and stigma, so they reinvented themselves under Italian names, food, and festivals. Over time, this performance grew into accepted fact, and the younger branches of the family tree were never told the truth. The revelation set off a cascade of emotions. At first there was grief, the sense that the foods she prepared and the traditions she followed were borrowed rather than inherited. It felt as though a major part of her identity had been taken away. But once the shock subsided, she began to reinterpret it as a gain rather than a loss. The Irish ancestry she had never acknowledged was real, and it linked her to histories and traditions she had never seriously explored. Leaning into that reality, she started tracing migration records, reading about Irish customs, and connecting with cultural communities she had never previously considered. Celebrations shifted, not in a way that erased the past, but in a way that expanded it. What once had felt like fiction now gave way to practices that reflected her genuine lineage. Her experience underscored how cultural memory can be shaped by reinvention as much as by bloodlines, and how easily those reinventions can calcify into heritage. When DNA strips away the facade, people must decide how to reconcile the lives they've lived with the histories revealed to them. Cases like this show heritage can bring pride, but it can also bring surprise. And in certain tests, the real shock doesn't come from losing a myth. It comes from gaining a link to darker stories, where family trees reach back not to community traditions but to figures remembered in the shadow of law and legend. Outlaw bloodlines from the Wild West. When people talk about surprising DNA results, most think about unexpected parents or siblings. But genetic testing has also surfaced connections that stretch beyond personal lineage, reaching deep into the movements of history itself. Instead of stories about undiscovered cousins, some families learn that their DNA places them in the middle of migration routes and cultural shifts once thought to be lost to time. These findings remind us that biology plays a role not just in rewriting family trees, but also in grounding folklore, oral history, and archival records in physical evidence. In recent years, genealogical DNA has been used to confirm surprising historical details. Studies cited by Wellcome and other research institutions show that consumer testing can identify patterns of human migration that textbooks only hypothesized about a few decades ago. For example, markers can reveal the ways in which European settlers intermarried with indigenous groups, or how populations moved across regions in the centuries after colonization. Even events that rarely appear in family documents, like mass displacement or forced migration, leave traces in the genome that later generations can still uncover. For families who receive such results, the impact can be startling. Expecting ethnicity percentages tied to modern nations, they may instead see signals from communities or lineages that have been overlooked in their household narratives. Sometimes this leads them to archival records, maps, or oral traditions they had never engaged with before. Through DNA, a local legend about an ancestor's ties to a frontier town, a seaport, or a trading post can gain substance as science confirms a tangible link. This blending of genetic evidence with history also reframes how we think about myth and fact. Folklore, particularly in regions like the American West, often carries stories of settlers, wanderers, and contested frontiers. But DNA testing doesn't separate those stories into neat categories of hero or villain. Instead, it shows that living descendants exist for all sides of the record: homesteaders and soldiers, merchants and migrants, and sometimes people once remembered for less honorable roles. What used to be confined to written archives or oral storytelling now extends into data visible on a living person's screen. For researchers, these unexpected results have become a resource for restoring forgotten voices. Large-scale studies of genetic variation across the United States and Europe, for example, have confirmed hidden pockets of ancestry tied to communities underrepresented in official records. This allows both professional historians and everyday individuals to place themselves within broader contexts than they may have imagined. The boundary between personal family history and shared cultural history becomes steadily thinner. Families who encounter these surprises often move from initial shock to a more nuanced reflection on heritage. Discovering ties to overlooked or misunderstood parts of history doesn't require pride or shame. It requires recognizing how complex identities can be across generations. A record-free gap in one century might re-emerge as a genetic marker centuries later. A forgotten branch of family memory can come back into focus, demanding not just acknowledgement, but understanding of the forces that once shaped it. It's in these moments that DNA testing transforms from a casual hobby into something weightier. The test results don't just confirm known ancestry, they reopen difficult conversations about belonging, identity, and the way history has been written or erased. And for some families, the most challenging revelations are not rooted in faraway archives, but in genetic connections that call into question the very identities they had always claimed as their own. White family finds hidden indigenous roots. For one family, what began as a casual DNA project to confirm their European roots revealed something they never expected. They had always seen themselves as entirely white, with family stories reinforcing that identity for generations. But when the test results came back, the charts pointed in a very different direction. Alongside the familiar European markers, the platform highlighted genetic links to indigenous populations, connections that none of their relatives had ever spoken about. At first, the family doubted what they were seeing. It seemed possible that the system had miscalculated percentages or misread the markers. But when multiple family members tested and received the same results, the pattern was undeniable. Every profile highlighted indigenous ancestry to some degree, repeating across different samples and eliminating the possibility of error. What the family had assumed was a straightforward cultural narrative now contained in a race chapter. Studies and surveys have shown that such outcomes are not unusual. Research cited by organizations like Welcome and Interbody emphasizes that many families carry indigenous or other minority ancestries that were deliberately downplayed or omitted in records, often due to historical discrimination or pressure to assimilate. Social dynamics of past generations encourage some families to erase or rename their identities for survival, blending into majority populations. When consumer tests expose these roots today, they restore heritage that official documents left incomplete. For this family, that restoration was anything but simple. Their community's relationship to indigenous peoples was shaped by a history of prejudice, exclusion, and contested identity. Recognizing indigenous bloodlines in their DNA meant facing that legacy directly, while questioning why ancestors had chosen not to pass it on as part of the family's story. Was it a calculated silence to avoid hostility and bias? Or had it simply slipped away over generations, leaving DNA as the only remaining record? Those questions had no clear answers, but the emotional weight of asking them reshaped how the family thought about themselves. Some members embraced the discovery quickly, diving into census records, migration histories, and local archives to understand where their relationships tied in. Others resisted, uneasy about abandoning the cultural identity they had been raised with. Family gatherings became points of debate. What should this discovery mean in practice? Did it change who they were or only add depth to the picture? Through those conversations, the family began to appreciate heritage in new terms, not as a neat, continuous line, but as a layered and at times uncomfortable reality. They came to see that their indigenous ancestry had not vanished. It had only been hidden by decisions shaped in harder times. Acknowledging this truth was not just about personal identity, it was about respecting ancestors who endured erasure and recognizing the weight of the histories they lived through. Researchers often advise that individuals who discover indigenous connections approach the subject with humility. Ethnicity estimates can be imperfect, so it's important to verify evidence carefully. Just as importantly, those new to such roots are encouraged to consult culturally informed sources and listen to the perspectives of indigenous communities, rather than treating DNA alone as a full explanation. The family in this case followed this guidance, reaching out to organizations, reading community histories, and treating their discovery with care rather than claiming it as a novelty. In the end, what began as a lighthearted experiment became a journey toward recognition and respect. For them, the test's value was not in adding a statistic to their profile, but in giving them a chance to acknowledge what silence had concealed. And while their discovery reframed identity across generations, another case showed how DNA can reveal hidden truths of a very different kind, stories of secrecy tied not to ancestry, but to the hidden lives of relatives whose roles in history were far more dramatic than anyone imagined. The spy grandmother. Sometimes DNA testing doesn't just redraw family trees, but points to chapters of history that were intentionally hidden. Researchers and journalists have noted that families occasionally use test results as a starting point to revisit archival records, and in rare cases, Those records reveal that ancestors had ties to military or intelligence work during wartime. When such discoveries arise, they often need to be carefully verified against primary sources, birth records, personnel files, or government documents, before they can be accepted as fact. Accounts exist where descendants, prompted by DNA matches, discovered relatives listed in official wartime registries or intelligence databases. In one case shared publicly, a family realized their ancestor had served in covert roles across Europe, something never spoken of at home. These revelations don't usually show up in consumer test dashboards directly, but rather emerge when families cross-reference the hints in their DNA reports with declassified records. The process pulls together multiple sources to confirm connections. Testing points to relatives, archives provide context, and historians interpret what those coded names and files meant. For the families involved, the effect can be profound. A quiet relative remembered as unassuming or modest suddenly appears in a different light, as someone active in wartime networks, courier routes, or intelligence-gathering operations. These new understandings often explain why earlier generations stayed silent about parts of the past. Secrets weren't only a matter of personal choice. They were part of duties kept hidden long after the wars had ended. Yet researchers emphasize caution. Misinterpretations are common, especially when dealing with common surnames or partial records. It's why journalists studying these cases stress that DNA can only open the door. It cannot, on its own, confirm espionage or covert service. Proper confirmation requires backing from verified documents, comparisons of dates and places, and sometimes testimony from colleagues or contemporaries who were directly involved. Without that context, speculation risks turning family anecdotes into ungrounded myths. Still, when carefully verified, such discoveries reshape more than family lore. They link living people to chapters of the world's most disruptive decades, reminding us that ordinary-seeming relatives sometimes carried extraordinary responsibilities. The tension between what families were told and what the records say can be emotional, even disorienting, yet it highlights how layered individual identities often are. Personal history and global history intersect in unexpected ways, and DNA makes it harder for those intersections to remain invisible. For most people, consumer DNA testing won't uncover hidden operatives or military networks. Instead, they'll see percentages of ancestry or records of migration. But knowing that some families have uncovered hidden wartime roles underscores a broader truth about testing. It can show us that the people we thought we knew had dimensions we never imagined, preserved quietly until science and archives converge to reveal them. While these rare cases focus on secrets buried in official files, other surprises unfold inside the test results themselves. Even when two people share the exact same DNA, the way technology interprets that data can take them in completely different directions. Identical twins, different ethnic maps. Two sisters decided to try DNA testing together, curious to see how closely their results would line up. They were identical twins, so the assumption seemed obvious. If their DNA was the same, the test outcomes should be identical too. They mailed off their kits, tracked their progress, and compared notes while waiting. When the reports finally arrived, their expectations quickly unraveled. At a glance, the charts looked broadly similar, but once they studied the numbers, the differences were striking. One twin's results showed what appeared to be a higher percentage of African ancestry, something she found both unexpected and exciting. Her sister opened her own report only to see stronger percentages pointing toward Middle Eastern ancestry instead. The fact that their ethnicity estimates didn't line up neatly felt bewildering. For twins who had shared appearances, milestones, and even mistaken identities in school, the contradictions seemed impossible to reconcile at first. How could identical DNA produce two different maps? Scientists have offered clear explanations for why this can occur. Consumer DNA companies don't present ethnicity estimates as direct readouts of genetic code. Instead, they scan thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs, across the genome and then compare those markers against proprietary reference panels. Algorithms interpret patterns, apply thresholds, and group DNA segments with the closest available populations. In this process, the raw genotype doesn't change, but the way the software reads and groups it can. Identical results on a genetic level can still be expressed differently when run against shifting datasets or algorithmic weightings. Even when the analyses begin from the exact same starting point, minor differences in how markers are assigned to clusters can yield significant variations on the output chart. If one company's reference dataset happens to emphasize a cluster associated with North Africa while another leans on Middle Eastern panels, a twin's DNA may appear to tilt in one direction one time and differently the next. These percentage breakdowns work best as broad regional approximations, not literal precision. The sisters eventually understood that their contradictions had less to do with biology and more to do with interpretation. Their DNA was fixed, but the storytelling, how that DNA was sorted, packaged, and presented, was flexible. Ethnicity estimates are not absolute truths but a reflection of probabilities, shifting slightly as algorithms are updated or databases expand. For the twins, that realization reframed what could have felt like an error into a lesson about how genetic testing works behind the scenes. What started as a fun experiment became a reminder that, while DNA testing is excellent at confirming close biological relationships and uncovering parentage issues, ethnicity percentages should be read more cautiously. Experts often stress that these reports are informative but not definitive. For individuals seeking more precise insights, whether for medical reasons or detailed ancestry research, options like whole genome sequencing or consultation with a genetic counselor provide far more reliable answers. The experience left the sisters with something both humbling and intriguing. They had spent their lives knowing they were virtually identical in every way, only to discover that the same DNA could still yield different narratives depending on who interpreted it. And if even twins can walk away with diverging stories, it raises a larger point. Sometimes testing redefines not how families look at each other, but how they understand the lineages and myths that have been passed down for generations. Royal blood hidden in ordinary family. In some families, DNA test results don't just add new names to a family tree, they challenge entire origin stories. One common surprise involves the discovery of unexpected ancestry that was never documented in records or spoken of at home. For generations, households have passed down strong cultural identities, only for science to reveal that the picture was incomplete or misattributed. Instead of confirming a long-told story, the test results pull families into new histories they didn't know they carried. Take the example of individuals who grew up believing their entire heritage was tied to a single European background, Irish, Italian, German, or French only, to have DNA reveal unexpected connections to other continents or neighboring cultures. In one widely discussed case, an adoptee who believed their family line stopped in the records of a local parish learned through DNA that their ancestry stretched across borders into an entirely different country. Further checks with archives confirmed that a child had once been quietly placed with relatives far from their birthland, leaving descendants unaware of the cross-national shift until modern testing provided proof. At first, results like these often spark disbelief. Families question whether the algorithms or the companies involved made mistakes. But when multiple relatives test and the patterns repeat across samples, denial is difficult to maintain. Research and journalistic reporting from outlets like The New Yorker and findings cited in genetic surveys reveal that such hidden ancestries are not rare. Generations of migration, adoption, and social stigma often led to identity reshaping, with certain heritages downplayed or erased to help families fit into their environments. Only now, with DNA databases numbering in the tens of millions, are those erased branches being restored. For some, the discoveries bring excitement. They open opportunities to explore new cultural traditions, join communities they never realized they were connected to, and reframe their understanding of who their ancestors were. Others, however, feel unsettled. A heritage once thought to be clear and uncomplicated suddenly becomes layered, mixed, and less easily defined. Identity becomes something that has to be renegotiated, not only in private but sometimes in public, especially in communities with strong ties to one cultural background. Historians caution that these surprises should not be viewed as rare, sensational twists. Instead, they are part of a predictable pattern. Illegitimate children, covert adoptions, concealed migrations, and undocumented unions have always existed, but written records did not always preserve them. What has changed is the ability for ordinary people to uncover those truths through the science of genetic genealogy. DNA has become the bridge between lived memory and erased memory, reattaching branches cut from the story. For the families who experience these moments, the outcome often blends humor, pride, and discomfort. Jokes about hidden roots transform into serious conversations around scanned documents and matches with newfound relatives. Household myths that once seemed entertaining shift into historical facts that must now be acknowledged. People raised with one identity find themselves carrying two at once. The stories of perseverance they always knew, and the hidden ancestry that remained unspoken until science brought it to light. These discoveries show how easily heritage can be reshaped by silence, and how swiftly it can be rewritten by evidence. DNA doesn't erase old stories, but it recontextualizes them, adding complexity where families once believed there was simplicity. And while some are surprised to learn of lost ancestry or unexpected cultural roots, others receive results that force them to confront questions not about distant history, but about the most immediate relationships in their lives. The father without genetics. Research into NPE, or not parent expected, experiences shows how destabilizing these discoveries can be. Studies published in BMC Psychiatry report that such moments commonly trigger grief, identity disruption, and strained relationships. One father's experience illustrates how a simple DNA test taken in good faith can unravel an entire personal narrative. He had 3 children, and for him the test was nothing more than a family activity. He joined the project casually, sitting with his kids and comparing notes while filling out the collection kits. He imagined laughter at the ethnicity breakdowns, maybe some playful arguments over traits or distant regions flagged in the results. Questions about paternity never crossed his mind. He had been there since birth, through sleepless nights, scraped knees, and school graduations. To him, this was a novelty without consequence. When the results arrived, he first admired how closely his children clustered together on the screen. Their profiles reflected the shared contribution of their mother, but once the system compared their DNA with his own, the pattern broke down completely. Parental links were absent, half his expected contribution was missing. He ran the comparison a second time, convinced of an error, then a third. Each result confirmed the same fact: genetically, none of the 3 children were his. The shock was immediate but deepened with every hour that followed. A relationship he had taken for granted was now pierced by something both cold and precise: data. Old arguments, unexplained absences, and subtle rifts in his marriage replayed in his mind with fresh clarity. Suspicions he had once ignored now appeared to have an explanation embedded in the genome. After confronting his spouse, the truth surfaced. The history of his marriage carried decades of silence and hidden relationships. The betrayal was not simply that his genes weren't reflected in his children, but that trust had been replaced by secrecy for so long. BMC's findings echo this outcome, noting that many who experience NPE revelations describe their pain less in terms of biology and more as a collapse of honesty and stability. For the children, the story shaped differently. They had never known another father. The one present at birthday parties, helping with homework, or offering advice during difficult moments had always been him. No graph could replace that lived reality. While he wrestled with betrayal, they pointed to what mattered most: love, loyalty, and presence over biology. Their family bond had been formed through experience, not chromosomes. Psychologists and genetic counselors emphasize the need for support during moments like these. They advise that anyone considering a DNA test, especially if family relationships are complicated, should think ahead about where to turn for help, whether that is a trusted friend, a therapist, or professional counseling. As the APA and BMC researchers make clear, guidance can ease the emotional impact and help families decide what to do next with the truths they uncover. For this father, the test fractured his marriage but clarified what remained intact. His children affirmed what had always been true in practice: he was their father because of the life they had shared. DNA may have ruled him out of their genetic story, but it could not erase him from their personal one. Not every revelation, however, points to hidden betrayals of marriage. Sometimes the truth presses forward from much earlier, from choices made in infancy, when adoption records and private decisions concealed identities for decades. The teacher who was the birth mother. Sometimes DNA doesn't point to strangers in distant cities. It reveals connections among the people we already know. Research and documented NPE cases show that adoptees or donor-conceived individuals have occasionally discovered their birth parents not as unknown names, but as people who were already part of their lives. Matches have been reported to link children with neighbors, former classmates, co-workers, and others they interacted with regularly, creating reunions in ordinary environments like school or work. BMC Psychiatry notes that these situations can be emotionally intense, often mixing relief with confusion and requiring careful handling. When relatives turn out to be close contacts, families must navigate the sudden collapse of boundaries between everyday routines and deeply personal identity. These cases highlight how genetic testing can turn the familiar into the unexpected, and how managing contact becomes one of the most sensitive challenges following a discovery. In other situations, though, the surprises arise not from everyday encounters, but from DNA results that touch directly on health and survival.